We all know how important reading is for kids. It's a way to teach, to expand their imagination and understanding of the world. But kids' literature is lacking in diversity, meaning many young readers aren't seeing themselves represented in the stories they read. Joining me to speak about the impact of that is author Zetta Elliott, whose books for children and young adults center Blackness and bring some much-needed diversity to the kid lit realm and bring a lot of diversity to my realm as well as I read to my children. Zetta, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Tracy.
Let's start with why you decided to write. And I imagine your experience is probably similar to mine, a voracious reader, but never seeing yourself.
So I grew up in Pickering in the 1970s, and I loved to read. Both my parents were teachers. I was introduced to reading at a very young age. But when you don't see yourself reflected in the pages of a book, that starts to have an effect. It can, in some kids, diminish their interest in reading. It can lead to diminished self-esteem because your life, your family, your community isn't being represented and validated within that book. And another consequence can be that you begin to identify with the people who are being validated. And for me, in the 1970s, and unfortunately still today, that tends to be majority white children.
Do you remember the first time you actually noticed that you weren't seeing a reflection of yourself anywhere in any of the literature you were reading? Do you remember how old you were?
Probably not until I was about 6, and then my father, who's Afro-Caribbean, kind of had a Black Power moment, and he started this summer camp, which was Afrocentric. And, you know, he made us watch Roots, and he brought home Anansi stories. And I remember we had like a Raffi album, and he was singing this Anansi song. But there weren't any Black people in the book. It was the spider, right? So I think probably around that moment, maybe 6 or 7. And that was probably the moment I started, you know, trying to pin a towel to my head so that I could conceal my afro and have the long flowing hair like the Charlie's Angels. So I think around that time.
It's almost a rite. It's the saddest rite of passage for Black little girls to do the towel. And I'm trying to like flip that with, you know, my daughter's generation, but we all did it. So yeah, I hear you. I want to talk a little bit about the poem that you wrote called A Place Inside of Me. And it was written in 2001, which actually seems like a generation ago because 2020 has been like 20 years long already. You wrote it back then, but it has been identified right now as a book that parents can use to sort of start those conversations about Black Lives Matter. Are you surprised that a book written in 2001 still has such relevance today?
Unfortunately, I'm not. I have self-published a lot of my books in order to get them into the hands of kids, and it's wonderful to see those now making the anti-racist reading lists that are circulating, but I wasn't surprised, and it's frustrating that it continues to be as relevant today as it was 20 years ago.
I want to talk about Say Her Name, which is a beautiful book. I have it right here in my hands, and just even reading the introduction, I was nodding, and I had a highlighter and I had a pen because so much of it was just touching my heart. And I'm just going to read one part of it. You said, "I have not lost a loved one to police violence, but I've been changed by seeing my sisters and brothers shamed, shot, and slammed to the ground. In response, I have not marched. My protest exists mostly on the page. Sometimes it feels like that's not enough. Other times I recognize we each have a role to play." There is activism happening in your books. People are reading about their experiences and they are saying her name and they are learning from this. And so I sort of wanted to ask you about that conflict, about feeling how can you help the cause, and is this the best you can do to help the cause? Because I ask myself this question all the time. And have you reconciled yourself with that as a writer?
I have not reconciled myself. I still have moments of intense guilt and grief. I have to say that lately I've been wanting to burrow deep under the covers. And then I feel guilt about that because I'm supposed to be a role model for young people. But what I have found is that honesty is really what our young people need right now. And so there's a poem in the book called How to Resist, right? And one of the stanzas says, write a poem, write a check. Take care of yourself. You know, self-care, as Audre Lorde said, you know, is radical. It's an act of self-preservation, and that's an act of resistance. So I really want to make sure that young people know that there are lots of different ways to participate in protest, I teach a poetry class. I'm teaching it this afternoon, and we're doing protest poetry so that young people can see how they can express themselves through words. Everyone has a role to play, and we all, I think, especially in this moment, have to be gentle with ourselves and be gentle with one another. It's also important to push yourself. I write about mental illness in the book as well, because I started experiencing depression as a teen and didn't know what it was, and it would have been helpful if someone had had that conversation with me. So we need to take care of ourselves, but also to take care of each other right now.
Zetta, you are moving the dial in your own way. You absolutely are. And I just want to give a shout out for more characters of color in areas without trauma. I think it's super important that we have sci-fi characters of color and fictional characters of color. I think it's a beautiful thing, and thank you for that, from my kids and from a parent's perspective. I appreciate that. Thanks, Zetta.